My name is Hannah Krull, and I use she, any pronouns. This is Butched Embodiment, Working Bodies in the Appalachian Landscape. This presentation was originally prepared for the Appalachian Studies Association Annual Conference. I would like to thank Dr. Christine Varnado and Dr. Kari Winter for their continued mentorship and support. These are some photos of the landscape around my hometown in the Enchanted Mountains of New York State. A little information about me. My hometown is Cuba, New York in Allegheny County, which is part of Northern Appalachia. On the right, you'll see the Appalachian region according to the Appalachian Regional Commission. This red X is Allegheny County. I'd like to briefly mention Casey Jakubowski, who recently published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies a brief examination of the northernmost Appalachian counties, southern tier New York. It's really exciting to see more scholarship about Northern Appalachia in the discipline. I currently live in Buffalo, New York, which is part of the Rust Belt and part of the northern westmost areas of New York State. Both Cuba and Buffalo are the unceded territory of the Seneca Nation and the Haudenosaunee people, where Seneca people continue to live and steward the land. I began to develop this research interest in undergrad through my gender studies major, and this became a large part of my honors thesis research. This presentation is just a small portion of that research, which I'm continuing to develop as an independent scholar. I'm also currently enrolled in UB's MS-ILS, Master of Science Information Library Science program. And I've presented this work elsewhere at the NEMLA 2023 conference under the title Queered Appalachia, Rural Working Women and the Embodied Landscape. First off, I'd like to ground this project and discuss some terminology. This research really is a love letter to the butch and butched women back home. When I first moved out of my hometown, I found that folks in urban environments that I was moving into would identify masculinity in women as queer. When for me, it was more common growing up to see what might be considered masculine, or what I can call butched women, rather than particularly feminine women. This is the short-haired, flannel-wearing, carabiner-carrying women who haul hay, till the farm plots, or drive truck that many of us might not give a second thought. As reported by Thompson in Visibility Interrupted, Rural Queer Life and the Politics of Unbecoming, one interview participant in the Midwest laughed, saying, "When we see someone at the bar, it's like, are they a lesbian or are they a South Dakota farm wife? Because sometimes you can't quite tell the difference." My work considers gender embodiment. I owe a great debt to Jack Halberstam's work on female masculinity. I have a specific focus on butchness. I engage with both butch women and women who have butch gender embodiments, as well as relationships to the land. That being said, some of the language in my presentation can seem a little binary and reductive. However, I'm mindful of imposing what are in a way urban labels and also northern labels on these women. So I want to create space for challenges to that and also respect the complexity of how to speak about these beloved folks. I also focus on relationships between rural and urban space. I consider Halberstam and Herring's work on metronormativity, where rural spaces are viewed with an urban lens which doesn't sufficiently or accurately address rural experience. And this framework is so common in academia and also politics, government, popular media, and so on. I also use the concepts of disidentification and legibility, inspired by Jose Esteban Munoz's Queer of Color critique. I also work on E. Patrick Johnson's work on queerness and racialized context within queer studies. To work on queerness in Appalachia, I found I needed to learn to disidentify with the discipline of queer studies itself. Carly Thompson's work on legibility and visibility among queer folks in the Midwest was also incredibly important in this project. And despite the proximity of my hometown to where I live now, less than 2 hours away, it's actually very hard for folks who aren't familiar with my hometown or Appalachia as a region to understand it. Therefore, Appalachian diaspora and outmigration are also critically important to this conversation, and I had to unlearn the stigma and stereotypes about Appalachia before I could really identify with and ground myself in that lineage, as I'm sure many other scholars in Appalachian studies have had to do as well. For my methodology, I chose to use life writing and memoir, with a mind for storytelling, with oral histories being a potential future aspect of this work. My thesis advisor, mentor, and dear friend, Dr. Kari Winter, supervised a directed study in which I produced personal narrative and life writing while working on this thesis to put my own experiences in conversation with the sources. There are some limitations. I focus on written memoir and life writing in part due to my perspective on ethical research practices. I want to avoid extractive and exploitative data collection, especially when there's no potential benefit to the people that I'm discussing in my work. In this avenue, I don't see a lot of particular benefit to them in me creating a presentation or an article. So I don't want to kind of take that out of the communities for my own benefit. If there was a different kind of product for this, that is something that I'd be interested in exploring further, but that would be something that would be done in conversation with the communities that I'm working with. Time and resource constraints of an undergraduate honors thesis were also important because I was working and teaching and did not have a ton of extra time to expand this thesis beyond the year-long project that I did have. And then also a wealth of resources were published between the time that I began the project and now, with a ton of really rich scholarship happening between 2022 and 2024. I intend to continue my work in this area independently and explore these ideas further and then explore some of these texts. But in this presentation, I only focus on things that were published a little bit earlier. What I found was that in the sources I explored and my own experience, working women's bodies operate as an extension of the landscape, in the deep grounding to place that many of us have identified in our scholarship and personal lives, and also as sites of extraction. I suggest that manual labor extracts physicality from bodies similarly to resource extraction and industry in the natural environment. This physicality has a gendered component that is aligned with queer framework. It butches women. This also ties into arguments that Appalachia operates as a queer space, though most of my work is grounded in the material conditions and embodied experience of queered bodies rather than temporalities. So why women in manual labor? In my sources, there is often a relationship between labor and independence and autonomy, though this is also dependent on racialized experiences. In the case of Cassie Chambers' book, Hill Women, Finding Family and a Way Forward in the Appalachian Mountains, Chambers' Aunt Ruth works the land to provide for a family of origin. There's also a significant relationship between non-normative relationships and women's labor, whether it be working widowers, divorcees, and other women who don't rely on male labor. In my own experience and observations, domestic violence and abuse also factors into these experiences. Alison Bechdel's Fun Home and Rachel Ann Jolie's Rust Belt Femme both involve the death of a father through vehicular tragedies and set the stage for the work done by the authors and their families. I argue that while gender and sex certainly impact labor experience, manual labor interacts with gender differently in rural and Appalachian spaces, and this embodiment is legible and contextually rich in Appalachia, yet, like many conceptions of Appalachia, it is still something foreign and ephemeral to those unfamiliar with the region. So, butch women. When I use this term, I'm not exclusively referring to masculine women or lesbians, but speaking to a certain gender which I posit exists and operates in Appalachian manual labor contexts, among other places. I use the term metronormative legibility to discuss these women, meaning that these women and this language are often viewed through urban-centric lenses in academia and in popular culture, which impacts how visible and legible they are to non-rural and non-Appalachian audiences. In Female Masculinity, Jack Halberstam discusses the pragmatic role of non-identificatory masculine gender embodiment. Masculinity, this book will claim, becomes legible as masculinity where and when it leaves the white male middle-class body. Halberstam argues that masculinity is precise and notable when deviating from culturally valued and dominant forms, yet is also quite expansive when it serves to fulfill some of those same valued roles, i.e. labor. Of course, there's nuance in rural spaces in Appalachia that Halberstam doesn't explore, but this work is really resonant in this area. I also want to mention country aesthetics, putting Scott Herring's work on ex-urban queers, such as the RFD or Radical Fairy Digest, and country women in conversation with Elena Anton's session at the ASA conference, Hillbilly to Hip, the Rise of Hillbilly Core in the Modern Aesthetic. When I was presenting this research, a small portion of a related but not entirely the same topic, at the NEMLA conference, the Northeast Modern Language Association conference in Niagara Falls in 2023, I kept being asked, why am I not calling these women queer? And the first answer is, I'm not going to tell anyone who or what they are. The value of queer studies is to explore the conceptual and lived experiences of butch women, but it's metronormative to require an identification rather than accepting the cultural and regional experience as related to, but separate from, identificatory queerness. E. Patrick Johnson's work, again, on queer studies, articulates additional problems with a white middle-class queer studies without attention to race and class dynamics, and also regional dynamics, in his case the South, and in ours, Appalachia. Of course, I also have to mention how non-idealized gender embodiment and policing of masculinity and femininity are grounded in colonialism and anti-Blackness. While the majority of my subjects are, in this formulation, white, they are both subject to weaponization of these standards and oftentimes protected from the worst of them. There's also already a critical identification of butchness as related to manual labor in manufacturing contexts, especially in the Rust Belt, in my research, notably Buffalo, my second beloved community, and Ohio in Rachel Angeli's Rust Belt Femme. Now that I've articulated this embodied butch gender as it relates to manual labor, I don't think it's particularly surprising the connection butched women have to the land. Whether it be through traditionally understood extractive industry, the new service industry, or efforts such as that to replace mining labor with environmentally degrading technological work, Appalachian bodies are often uniquely gendered and exploited through labor. There are clearly impacts on bodily health as a result of this labor, though the proliferance of black lung is one notable and critically important example. Chambers Hillwomen also articulates the impact of pesticides and other technologies present in manual labor environments as having negative health impacts. Matthew Ferentz's Appalachian North combines health memoir with a love letter to Appalachian land, further exploring the embodied nature of the landscape with specific attention to northern Appalachia. Another example of how life writing and memoir tells stories about us and our environments as co-constituted. I'd like to see more memoirs in this vein. Just like standards for bodies are informed by colonial and racialized lenses, so too is the land. Stolen and occupied land, now known as the United States, taken from indigenous peoples and toiled over by enslaved Black and African folks, the land bears the wounds of white supremacy just as racialized and oppressed bodies do. In summary, working Appalachian women engage in contextually legible butch gender. This butch gender is non-identificatory and is distinct from queer identity, though in some cases they are present simultaneously. Labor is extracted from these bodies in ways which parallel the extractive industry present in the region. Extractive industry and manual labor harms the body similarly to the harms done to the landscape, such as mountaintop removal and polluted waterways. The forms of labor, gender, and violence discussed are racialized and reliant on colonialism and white supremacy. I also want to briefly mention a few points for further research. Regarding indigeneity, disidentification, and digiqueer and two-spirit positionalities, I've included a few citations to authors who are doing parallel work in this area. Racialization, as I've mentioned, is a hugely important element of this study, and arguably one that I haven't explored enough. My home county, Allegheny County, is 95% white, and indigenous folks are represented more than most other racial and ethnic groups, though they aren't necessarily noted as such on the census due to issues with collection and understandable distrust of the government. And that informs my research as well. Clearly, labor operates differently in urban and rural spaces, even across Appalachia, and there's likely sub-regional nuance within Appalachia. I've included my references here and here. If you're interested in finding me, you can find me on LinkedIn here. I'm also posting these slides there as well. And you can send me an email at hannah.r.krull@gmail.com, and I will get back to you if you have any questions about my citations. I'm more than willing to share anything that I have in relation to this research. Thank you again, and I look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you.